about to be live right now. If you could mute yourself, please.
Sorry.
No, don't worry.
Is that better?
No,
And then when I'm handing it off to you, then we can turn it back up. Okay. Dr. Miller, you can hear me?
I can. And by the way, Muhammad, remember, no doctors.
Okay, all right.
Above all, no doctors, please.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. 1 second, sorry. Sorry, 1 second, just taking care of the technical stuff. Okay. So thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Muhammad. I'm the executive director here at the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center. As always, it's a pleasure to welcome you here all, and we hope you're all doing well. Before we get started, I just wanted to ask if you could please continue to support us, whether through a donation and or, of course, by spreading the word about us to your family and friends. That would be very helpful and we would really appreciate it. Today, we're very happy to host Dr. Aaron David Miller, who will be giving a talk titled "The Middle East, No Longer as Important as It Used to Be." We're also happy to have Saeed Arakat here as the moderator for today's event. So several factors have combined to diminish the Middle East's importance at the elite and public level, including the disastrous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, a new definition of homeland security in which the threat of a virus is much greater than jihadi or white nationalist terror, the diminishing importance of Arab hydrocarbons, a renewed focus on China, and above all, the importance of fixing America's broken house. Crises are always possible that might draw America in, and that's why if Biden's administration focuses on anything, it will be Iran and an effort to defuse issues that could prompt war. Recent developments in the Israeli-Palestinian arena suggest that without some move by the Palestinians or Israel, the new administration is unlikely to spend a great deal of time on this issue. So a little bit about Dr. Aaron David Miller. He is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a former State Department Middle East analyst and negotiator in both Republican and Democratic administrations. He is a CNN Global Affairs analyst and the author most recently of The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. And a little bit about Saeed. He is a member of our Palestine Center Committee and the Washington bureau chief for the Palestinian newspaper Al-Quds, a daily for which he is a writer, columnist, and analyst. He previously served as spokesman and director of public information for the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq, and currently teaches as an adjunct professor at American University in Washington, D.C. After the discussion, we will have a Q&A session. You can send us your answers on the YouTube chat sidebar, or you can tweet to us on our Twitter account, which is @PalestineCenter. So we will go ahead and get started, and I want to thank both of you again for being here. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to it. So now I'll hand it off to Saeed.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Aaron. It's really an honor to be with you moderating this session. I mean, talk about the voice of experience and knowledge in this town, and all things really Middle Eastern as well as American politics. in general. So I appreciate it. And Aaron will speak for about 15 minutes, and we will get the questions and answers. With that, please go ahead.
Hey, thanks so much. It's really wonderful to be here, and I want to thank the Jerusalem Fund and Mohammed for inviting me. A few comments about my personal perspective. Having traveled the negotiating highway for about 20 plus years under both Republican and Democratic Secretaries of State with respect to U.S. policy. Number one, for me, the dividing line between an effective U.S. foreign policy is not between left and right, Republican or Democrat, or liberal and conservative. It's between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And the only question that remains is which side of the line do you want America to be on, the smart side or the dumb side? I have some suggestions that I could offer in terms of how, even in this age of polarized and tribal politics, that it's possible to remain on the smart side. Number two, I'm not a religious person, but I become a devoted follower of the great Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. And Niebuhr believed, as Catholic, Niebuhr believed, I think profoundly, not that individuals couldn't seek redemption or improve themselves, but that they were also weak. And from that, he, I think, drew the conclusion that to try to enlist large numbers of human beings in comprehensive solutions that would somehow address problems in a comprehensive manner would be very difficult. And he developed the notion of proximate solutions to insoluble problems. And I'll say it again, proximate solutions to insoluble problems, because frankly, if you look at how things change, not just abroad, but certainly with respect to the American experiment, it is gradually and incrementally, even though there may be transformations, and there have been in American politics and American history, those transformations are usually implemented and play themselves out over time in many respects, ways that are much less revolutionary or transformative than many people would have liked. And, you know, it's not for nothing we don't have a sensible gun control policy in this country, nor I would argue that we don't have a sensible healthcare policy. And I think a lot of this flows from the nature of the American experiment and the American character. You watched it play out over the last 8 or 9 months in the face of COVID. I'm even wondering, a thought experiment here, had you had a different president, whether or not large numbers of Americans would still have refused to abide by sensible, scientifically based recommendations to wear masks, to social distance, to remain at home, and in certain cases under varying degrees of lockdown. And I think in some respects, that's a Niebuhrian example of a proximate solution to an insoluble problem. Another factor that has influenced the way I look at the world, many Americans, and I would add myself to this list, have a hard time understanding the world. And I would argue that's largely because of our physical geography, where we are. And we are in a location that is quite fortuitous and quite extraordinary. Not a single power in the international system today enjoys the sense of physical security that we do. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, Canada and Mexico, and we have fish to our east and west. What one historian, I wish it had been me, described as our liquid assets. These two liquid assets, these two oceans, give us a degree of physical security and detachment, which is unprecedented and unrivaled. And as a consequence of these two oceans and the fact that we have non-predatory neighbors to our north or south, we've developed a certain set of responses to the world. Number one, we look at the world far too often in an arrogant fashion, because our margin for error is huge. No other country in the world could make the kinds of mistakes we do without threatening their physical security or their coherence, political coherence. Number two, it explains our idealism. We somehow believe that all problems have solutions, and at times American solutions. And number three, it explains our naivete, because I really believe we have forgotten, if we ever knew, how small powers behave and why they behave the way they do. From the Israelis to the Palestinians to the Egyptians to the Iranians, and even larger powers like the Russians and the Chinese. None of these countries have freed themselves to the extent we have from the forces of history or geography. To the extent that a nation can free itself from these two forces, it's really quite extraordinary. And we, to a degree that I think is humanly possible, have managed to do this. The Russians will never free themselves from the forces of history or geography, or either will the Chinese. Certainly that applies to the Israelis, it applies to the Palestinians. And I would argue it probably applies to most countries in the Middle East. And finally, and this is a very important point for me, I've learned a lot over the years, there's no gold standard for objectivity. We are all the sum total of our experiences. I have not met anyone yet who could claim a pure standard of objectivity when it comes to trying to understand, let alone assess and analyze, the positions of parties in conflict. The best you can do, in my judgment, the best you can do is to make allowances for the prejudices you have, or the prejudgments you have. That's really what a prejudice is, right? It's a prejudgment. Make allowances for them, set them aside, and try to the extent that is humanly possible to understand empathetically why country X or national movement X behaves the way they do. So with that as a sort of introduction, let me make a few points about the diminishing importance of the Middle East. The fact that it is diminished importance does not mean it is of no importance. And I don't want to be misunderstood here. It's not as if this region has gone from an area of intense American interest over the last 70 years, all of a sudden to a region that we can simply forget and or walk away from. We have allies, we have adversaries, we have interests. There are peoples in this region about whom we care and want to see a more secure and prosperous future. But nonetheless, I think it's important to recognize that a number of factors have emerged that have made this issue and this region far less importance as a vital American national interest. And I'm going to qualify this even more. But let me just address some of them. First of all is the challenge of domestic recovery, or what I call America's broken house. I would argue to you that there's not a single foreign policy challenge out there, not one, or a combination of challenges that represent a greater threat and danger to the health and well-being of the American Republic than the challenges that we face here at home. And I don't say this in a hysterical fashion, but I think our predicament, our situation, as rendered by George Packer recently in The Atlantic, this may be something of a hyperbole, but I think it's worth examining, that we have become two separate countries. Neither can be conquered, and neither is going anywhere anytime soon. The results of the recent election, where the Republican president polled the second highest numbers of votes in the last century in an American presidential election, in addition to getting a greater share of the non-white vote in America than any candidate, Republican candidate, in the last 60 years, suggests a degree of polarization, almost tribalization in our politics. And that's simply one of the issues that we face. When President-elect Biden is inaugurated on January 20th, it is conceivable that 3,000 Americans may be dying every single day from COVID-19. And I think we have to face up to the fact that the pandemic has exposed real fault lines and cleavages in our social, economic, and political structure. So the emphasis is going to be on fixing America's broken house. Joe Biden's presidency will be measured and defined not by what he accomplishes abroad, but by whether or not he can address the core challenges that affect most Americans. Second, over the last 20 years, we've wrestled at great expense in American lives and Afghan lives and Iraqi lives, and they've paid a far greater price than we have. We've expended trillions of dollars and what remains of American credibility on 2 wars, now the longest in American history. And I might add, a 4th administration is now going to grapple in a matter of weeks with the same problem of Iraq and Afghanistan that 3 preceding administrations have wrestled with. And the standard for victory in these 2 wars, in my judgment from the beginning, I left government 3 months before we invaded Iraq. The standard for victory was never could we win in a conventional sense, but when could we leave and what would we leave behind? And I would argue to you that that Iraq and Afghanistan have created, for the last 3 administrations, a measure of risk aversion that will influence America, not just in the Middle East, but in other areas of the world as well. So this is a bad history. If you wanted to demonstrate that America could succeed in this region, spend money, even sacrifice American lives in the pursuit of vital interests, these are not the 2 poster children that you'd want to use. And the polls, including among veterans, argue for withdrawal. I would also argue to you that I suspect that if we gather a year from now and I come back to talk to the Jerusalem Fund, we'll still be in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, whether that deployment is manageable, how large it will be, I can't say, but we will still be there, grappling with the same problems that we've grappled with for almost 20 years. Number 3, as far as the Arab world is concerned, the Arab Spring has created a legacy that has further reinforced America's risk aversion, not risk readiness, risk aversion to this region. I'll quote to you the 1st century Roman historian Tacitus, who said that the best day after the death of a bad emperor is always the first day. I'll say it again. The best day after the death of a bad emperor is always the first day. And what Tacitus meant by that, watching Rome, is that sure, you could throw off the shackles of a Mubarak or a Ben Ali or a Hafez Assad. The question is, and people will rejoice rightly, the question is not the headline. The question is the trend line. What happens afterwards? And I would argue, I don't even have to argue. I would simply assert to you that right now, 9 years after the beginning of the Arab Spring, you have at least 5 Arab states, 5, in varying degrees of dysfunction: Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. And the 3 key Arab states that have traditionally competed for influence and power in the Arab world for decades: Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Now, my words here, I would describe them as essentially offline. They are less able to throw around their regional weight, influence, and power than ever before. And I would argue that in many respects, not in all, this has denied the United States reliable partners with which to deal. The fact that these 3 Arab states are offline has opened up opportunities, and you've seen them, for certain states in the Gulf namely Saudi Arabia, which has been ruthless and reckless in its influence, and the Emiratis, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed in particular, who's been much more restrained, disciplined, and effective. That's been one consequence. And the US has to some degree, established in this administration relationships with these two states. I would argue to you, we've provided the Saudis with nothing short of a zone of immunity. And I suspect that's going to be somewhat corrected during the Biden administration. But it's also allowed three other actors, the three non-Arabs, to assert themselves. If you ask me, Saeed, today, who are the three most powerful states in the region? I would argue the three non-Arabs, Turkey, Iran, and Israel. All are domestically stable, all have tremendous economic potential, all have militaries and intelligence organizations that are quite formidable, all can project their power beyond their borders. One is a member of NATO, one is America's closest ally in the region, and the third is an outlier to some degree. And it'll be interesting to see, because I think this is where the Biden administration would like to spend its time, how the US-Iran relationship plays out. It's going to be extremely difficult. Then you have the issue of Arab hydrocarbons. The United States is, through fracking, which is not terribly great for the environment, but has boosted American oil and natural gas production to make us the largest producer in the world. We are freeing ourselves from Arab hydrocarbons to a degree that never existed before. Now, 10% of the world's oil still flows out of Saudi Arabia and through the Gulf. And as a consequence of that, we still have a stake in maintaining and ensuring that that oil flows freely, to be sure. But the lack of dependence on Arab hydrocarbons is just another reason why there's a certain freedom and room to maneuver that did not exist before vis-a-vis this region. And two additional points. New priorities. The US-China relationship is in free fall. Whether this administration will be able to address that issue effectively or not, I don't know. But Asia and farther east, I would argue to you, is going to be a area of much greater significance and priority for the United States. And finally, and I think this is quite telling, we spent billions of dollars since 9/11 trying to confront the threat, the legitimate threat that we faced on 9/11 from Sunni jihadi terrorist movements, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and all of their derivatives. But when the real threat to the Republic came, it came in the form of a virus, which has, by the time it works its cruel way through this country, could end up killing 400,000 or 500,000 Americans, sickening millions, destroying an economy, and altering our way of life. And 2 out of the 3 newly discovered pathogens in the world today are viruses. So I'd have to ask myself the question, where's the real threat to America? Where's the real vital interest? It's going to come, as it's come before, from a virus, not to mention the other problem, which is climate. So those priorities are going to figure much more centrally in American policy, it seems to me, in the years to come, than trying to fix problems in the Middle East that may well be beyond our capacity to fix. Now, let me just say a word or two about the Biden administration, and then I'll close. The Biden administration is not going to approach this region the way the Trump administration did. The Biden administration believes in something called the American national interest. Now, how you define it is another matter, but I could say to you categorically that in the view of the incoming administration, it's not going to be tethered, as it was during the Trump administration, to the president's personal politics, an effort to cater to his domestic base, or his own personal vanity and sensibility. That's over. I think it'll sound better, the Biden administration policy. It'll look better. Human rights will play a more significant role. I would argue not an overriding role, but we will not be on what one of my colleagues at Carnegie, Ashley Tellis, called the values holiday that the Trump administration has taken, in which you simply suspend any commitment to American ethics, values, and principles, and you subordinate them to what you can get transactionally from this dictator or that dictator. I think, as I indicated before, the main priority of the administration will be Iran. Now, why do I say that? For one simple reason. If they look around the region and they think to themselves, what is the one issue that could interfere with our real priority, which is domestic recovery? What's the one issue that could lead to war? Not just between Israel and Iran, but between Iran and the United States. It's Iran, the nuclear issue, ballistic missiles, and Iran's regional behavior. There is no other issue in this region, none. Not one that even comes close to having the potential to upset regional stability. So I argue logically that if they can, and this is, of course, the problem, there's another actor in this play, well, many other actors actually, including the Saudis and the Israelis, who will bond together, I think they already have, to send a message to the Biden administration: don't go down this road with the Iranians again. Don't go back into this agreement. But I think the administration will look for a way to do that. Final comment on the Palestinian issue. There used to be a time, and I remember writing memos to secretaries of state in the 80s and arguing that the Palestinian issue was the central issue. Not just the Palestinian issue, resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict was the central issue to Middle East stability and the key to American credibility and influence in the region. Given what's happened over the last, well, the 80s were a long time ago. I mean, that's 40 years ago. But given what's happened over the course of those 4 decades, I can't argue that anymore. I'm not suggesting that the Palestinian issue is not important, but it's become important in a much less expansive context than it used to be. And one of the ways that one of the reasons for that is because of this process of interstate relations that are developing between Israel and the Gulf states. This has tended to de-regionalize the Palestinian issue and make it local. And if it's local and its potential for fundamentally altering regional stability is less than it used to be, then I would argue, unless there is a reason to involve themselves in a major way. Now, there's a difference between what you're going to see from the administration, which is re-engaging with the Palestinian Authority at a high level. There may be an effort to reopen a consulate. There may be in Jerusalem, there may be an effort to restore American funding to UNRWA. If Congress cooperates, you could see a resumption of bilateral assistance to the Palestinian Authority. You might even see at some point, not soon, the reopening of the PLO office in Washington. But what you won't see is what you saw during the previous administration, which is a call for a comprehensive freeze on settlements, a timetable for an Israeli-Palestinian agreement on permanent status, or an American peace plan. Biden will look more like Bill Clinton than he will Barack Obama. So I will, I've gone on farther, longer than I should have. We can talk about some of these issues in more detail.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Aaron. I mean, we could probably spend the whole Zoom session on any of the many points that you mentioned today, but obviously we are a bit more interested in the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Although, I mean, the diminishing aspect of the Middle East, one can see it all over. But from time to time, we are reminding that it remains important. And we saw this, if you recall, in 2012, for instance, when there was a pivot to Asia, and in fact, Secretary Clinton at the time was in Asia, and then she had to cut short her trip and go and negotiate, a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. So it's a nagging issue. It's not going to go away. It keeps festering. There are times when it seems that it has ebbed. And then, lo and behold, we are, awakened with like a stark slap on the face or something like this. So, and looking at this administration, what it has done in the past 4 years. On the one hand, Trump said that I want to disengage, I want to withdraw, I want to focus internally and so on. But we saw him probably more engaged with Israel than any other administration in terms of, probably crossing milestones or taboos and so on, such as recognizing Jerusalem as a capital, moving the embassy there, sending as one of the latest acts, sending the Secretary of State Pompeo to a settlement, something unheard of before and so on. So there is that, engagement that will continue to be there. And, simply the Palestinians and the Israelis are not going anywhere. I mean, so with that, I know you said that we will see some things. Probably we will not see the Jerusalem embassy returned to Tel Aviv. We are not going to see that, but we probably see, the reopening of the Jerusalem consulate in East Jerusalem, the consulate, which has been around for 175 years. It's been there for a very long time, and some aid and so on. But beyond that, let me ask you, beyond that, what could or should the Palestinians do to really engage the coming administration, more sincerely, than this administration has been in terms of moving towards some sort of restart of negotiations or resumption of negotiations or moving forward towards a solution?
I do more listening these days than talking. And one of the things I don't do, at least on the Palestinian side, is give them advice anymore. I think that the Palestinian situation is worse than I've seen it in decades, that the national movement is fundamentally divided and largely dysfunctional. One thing, Arafat never would have permitted what happened in 2007 to happen. And the fact that you don't have one gun, one authority, and one negotiating position means that the prospects of a unified Palestinian negotiating position where one central authority controls all the guns of Palestine is unlikely to happen. That's a huge constraint, and it allows those who are not interested on the Israeli side in any sort of settlement along the lines that Palestinians would accept. And I would include the Prime Minister of Israel here. I mean, it's no secret. I mean, we're giving Benjamin Netanyahu a test he cannot possibly pass. He was not put on this earth in his own self-image to become the midwife and father of a Palestinian state based on June 67 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital. He's never going to participate in anything like that. I would argue, Said, that if you wanted to have a serious negotiation leading to a serious agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, you need three things. I would change my tune in a minute, even if you could get two of them. Number one, you need leaders on both sides who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their ideologies, willing to take risks. Every time there's been a breakthrough in this conflict, without exception, it's been because you had leaders who were prepared to act. Whether it was Begin and Sadat, Arafat and Rabin, Hussein and Rabin, you don't have that now. Number two, you need a sense of ownership on the part of Israelis and Palestinians that you don't have right now. Do you know the breakthroughs in this conflict were all done without the foreknowledge of the United States? I remember on October 1977, I had just been hired by the Department of State when Moshe Dayan shows up and briefs the State Department that he had been meeting secretly with Sadat's vice president. I remember being on vacation in Florida in August of '93 when I get a call from the State Department Operations Center telling me that Christopher is on his way to meet Peres and Foreign Minister Holst. We knew there was an Oslo channel. We hadn't a clue that they were that close to an agreement. And the Israelis and Jordanians have been negotiating secretly with one another for decades, even before there was a state of Israel. So every breakthrough in this conflict occurred not as a consequence of what America did or did not do. Once there was a foundation, then the United States, with varying degrees of success, Kissinger, Carter, and Baker, I'll say it again, Kissinger, Carter, and Baker, the only three Americans, in my judgment, who have played seminal roles in this enterprise, truly seminal roles. Which brings me to the third issue. You don't have and have not had an administration since Bush 41 and one of my former bosses, James Baker, who was willing to apply not just honey, but vinegar to both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And trust me on this, nobody's going to plant a tree in your honor during the course of a successful negotiation between Arabs and Israelis. You're going to earn the undying, well, maybe not undying, you're going to earn a lot of reaction from a lot of very unhappy people. Jimmy Carter is still can't understand why the Jewish community in the United States didn't vote for him. So I think none of these factors are present. There are no leaders, there's no ownership, and you don't have an administration, or if it's not the United States, then bring in another mediator, the Russians, the UN, the French. But none of these factors are present. I don't think there's a country in the entire world that is prepared to make the Israeli-Palestinian issue a central feature of their foreign policy. They're just too distracted and preoccupied with the health and well-being of their own societies. So maybe something can change, but the status quo, however horrible it may be, has proven to be remarkably sustainable. A lot of people hold us responsible for that. They argue that you're enabling the Israelis, that if you only did this, this, and this to the Israelis, everything would be fine. Now, that's a thought experiment because we've never done this, this, and this to the Israelis. And I would argue, and I'm just reporting here, that's as a consequence of many factors, some of which may be changing, a younger generation who are not as supportive of Israel. I just don't see that change coming that rapidly. The change, I'll believe it when I see large numbers of Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate having an honest conversation about how Israel deals with the Palestinians and how the US deals with Israel. I haven't seen it, and it's not good enough to have 4 or 5 members of Congress or even a handful of senators who are prepared to speak out on this issue. You need large numbers of them. And I just don't see that happening. And frankly, you say the Trump administration was engaged. Yeah, they were engaged.
Yeah.
But they were engaged in a way that was, in my judgment, with the exception of facilitating or jumping on a bus that had already left the station with respect to Israel's relations with the Gulf states as a consequence of their growing concern about Iran. Trump administration, in my view, has done more to harm the prospects for a serious Israeli-Palestinian negotiation by enabling the Israelis or this particular government and by declaring a campaign of political and economic pressure against the Palestinians than any administration I ever worked for.
Well, yeah, I mean, I said engaged, but not necessarily in a good way. They were engaged against the Palestinians, so they really a great deal of harm. But let me ask you, I mean, because when you mentioned you've been there for all this time, you were there early on in 77 and in 93, as someone who had such a front row seat to all these negotiations, do you think that the Palestinians part of the negotiation was all for naught? I mean, I looked 20 days ago, or not even, 20 days ago, Saeb Erekat, who negotiated for the better part of his life for 27 years, finally died of COVID, unfortunately. But his effort, I mean, where are the Palestinians after all these negotiations? Could you foresee some sort of, a different approach to negotiations?
If you're talking about a two-state solution, I mean, I'm not going to tell you that the Palestinian narrative or the Palestinian negotiating position, which is based on basically the 67 borders minus swaps, a real capital in East Jerusalem, some set of security arrangements with the Israelis that won't completely humiliate them and leave them sovereignty-less, and some resolution of the refugee problem. Who knows how that is going to be handled? That's their position. That's the position that they've adhered to for decades now. I mean, I could tell you, okay, have them abandon large parts of that narrative, settle for less. But I'm not going to say that, because you're dealing with an Israeli government under Benjamin Netanyahu. And again, I'm just reporting here, who has no interest and no intention in creating a negotiation that even comes close. Even if the Palestinians were prepared to compromise some on borders and Jerusalem, I don't think it would be enough to satisfy. And it may not be enough to satisfy Netanyahu's successor, whoever that may be. So I can't say to you that I can't give you a roadmap to guide the Palestinian national movement if their position is a sovereign, independent state with real contiguity, living next to Israel in peace and security. If that's their position, and it is their position, until it no longer becomes clear to them, and maybe we've reached that point, that that's no longer possible because of Israeli settlement policies. I mean, it's pointless, it seems to me, to offer advice. Not only won't they take it, but I'm not sure I have the answer. If I did, if I knew what to do, I might consider at least becoming an informal advisor to the incoming administration, but I don't have
You ought to, yeah.
I don't have an answer
Right.
to
Well,
this.
I tell you what, this is a good point to go to some questions. I'm getting a lot of questions. And there's one, of course, directed to you on your role. One, it says, do you believe the United States was ever truly committed to the creation of a Palestinian state? Do you believe Israel was? I mean, you said about Netanyahu, he was never committed to that, but yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think that part of the problem is that finding a way to reconcile even the positions of those Israeli prime ministers who I think were serious. I mean, Rabin died before we really knew what his positions on final status would be. He was much more interested if he could get an agreement with Assad than with the Palestinians, or Shimon Peres or Ehud Barak. Even if you took their positions, as we did at Camp David 20 years ago this past July, and stacked them up against one another, the gaps were enormous. I mean, the myth of Camp David is that we were this close to an agreement. We were this close to an agreement at Camp David, and we've never been this close to an agreement in the 20 years subsequently. So do I think the United States was serious? I think the Clinton parameters in December of 2000 would have been a basis for negotiating an actual two-state solution. But for reasons of timing, the Second Intifada, Arafat's own notion that he'd rather wait for the Bush administration, he confused the second Bush administration with the first Bush administration. And the Clinton parameters basically, and I don't think, frankly, in December of 2000, with less than a month to go before the new president was inaugurated, that you could have done anything with the Clinton parameters. But had they become the basis of the next administration's policy, I think we would have at least tested the proposition, because what was offered at Camp David was not an adequate test, in my judgment. So yeah, I think had you negotiated around those Clinton parameters and improved them, I think you might have been able to actually reach an agreement. But it's a thought experiment, Saeed.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's your point about confusing the second Bush administration, Bush 43, with Bush 41. That's a very good point. I also have a question that about something that you wrote back in 2005, Washington Post op-ed. You wrote that too often the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, the United States acted like Israel's attorney.
Lawyer.
Okay.
Right. You know, that article.
What responsibility does the
right.
US have
that phrase, Israel's lawyer,
Mhm.
I found in Kissinger's memoirs.
Okay. Yeah.
And I resurrected it for James Baker,
Right.
who loved it. He thought this was the greatest phrase he'd ever seen. And he kept repeating, I'm not going to be Israel's lawyer. Don't make me Israel's lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is, far too often, we behaved in a way that was fundamentally much closer to the Israeli positions in negotiations than the Palestinians. We had a no surprise policy. I remember, and I miss Saab greatly. I remember on the fourth day of the Camp David summit, I saw him walking on one of the paths. We were supposed to give the Palestinians a paper. And he said, when's the paper coming? And I said, we're not quite done with it yet. And he smiled because he knew we had given it to Barak first. And Barak hated it and we changed it. And then we gave it to Arafat, and he hated it. And it was on that day that I knew the summit was over. It was on that day that I realized the summit was running us. We weren't running the summit. So, yes, do I think that through the no surprise policy and through close coordination with the Israelis, and particularly on security issues, which might be understandable, that we took their part in most of it? Yeah. And I think that is a problem because, as Saab used to say, I'm not pro-Palestinian, I'm not pro-Israeli, I'm pro-peace. We needed to lawyer for both sides. Our client should not have been Israel or the Palestinians. It should have been both. And more broadly than that, our client should have been in agreement.
Let me ask you on this point, Aaron, what should the individual negotiators have done in terms of assuming sort of personal responsibility to affect the outcome of negotiations? I mean, I am no negotiator, but I did work. I negotiated between different groups in Iraq, about the Iraqi constitution and so on. And it's very difficult, but sometimes you as a negotiator can influence. So what role did you play and others that, we know?
Ultimately, it's up to the president of the United States.
For sure. I'm not saying it isn't.
What the positions are. So you can argue your case. I would argue to you that we did have on our team individuals who were prepared to argue the Palestinian case to a degree. All right. We have this thing called the special relationship with the state of Israel, which exists independently, frankly, of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And we have no such similar relationship with any Arab country or with the Palestinians. So this relationship, which is driven by many factors, and I might add not just the presence of a large and affluent Jewish community in this country who lobbies on Israel's behalf. Frankly, that position is now in many respects overtaken by millions of evangelical Christians who are much more united on the question of Israel than the Jewish community.
For sure, yes.
But Kissinger, Carter, and Baker showed that a willful U.S. policy could overcome domestic politics in pursuit of an agreement. So I would argue to you that individual negotiators had a responsibility to argue for proposals that offered the best possible chance of reaching an agreement. But those proposals had to be consistent with all the other factors that a president of the United States considers when they're involved in negotiation. Clinton, and he said it repeatedly, did not want to, quote, jam the Israelis, unquote. Now, fighting with Israel, as Kissinger, Carter, and Baker understood, is part of the process of a successful negotiation. But you don't fight with Israel, with a close American ally, if there's no chance of winning. You fight because the fight will be productive. And frankly, I don't, and I'll say it again, not since Bush 41 or James Baker, and it's not just true on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, have we been admired and respected as much as we need to be.
Yeah. Well, so many questions, ranging from Clinton blaming Arafat and others and so on for the negotiations to the issue that you raised about confusing the two Bush.
And I might add, Clinton promised Arafat in June that he would not be blamed and he would not be jammed.
Right. Okay. Yeah, understood. But I wanted to ask you, last summer we saw before the all the fever around before the normalization between Arab countries and Israel. There was, of course, talk in the American press among Jewish intellectuals and so on about the one-state solution. That maybe this situation, this logjam is really insoluble, like you mentioned in the beginning, and maybe the way forward is to have a democracy for Palestinians and for Jews, for Israelis.
Yeah, and if I seriously believe that on December 3rd, is that the date today?
Yes.
December 3rd, 2020, most Israelis and Palestinians supported that, no problem. It's just, I don't think that's the case now. And I worry that I mean, look, if you ask me, do I think the two-state solution is dead? I would argue to you, no, but it really does require what I call heroic diplomacy on the part of three parties. You could add the Arabs as a fourth party, Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans. Truly heroic diplomacy. When I hear enough Palestinians say to me they're no longer interested in a fulfillment of their national aspirations in an independent sovereign state, and I hear the same music from the Israelis, then I think you could look at all kinds of alternatives as operational possibilities. But when I look at the problem, what is the basic problem between Israelis and Palestinians right now that separates that conflict from all of the others, Israel, Jordan, Israel, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt? It's the proximity problem. It's how to fix the fact that Israelis and Palestinians are living on top of one another, that their lives, their futures are inextricably linked. Now, the one-state solution assumes you can fix that problem by making them more proximate. We'll create one big happy house where the territorial differences at the overlapping sacred space that exists on Haram, for example, can all be fixed. I just don't, I don't believe in transformations. And I look at the world and look for any parallel example of reconciling two national groups with the traumatic and bitter history that they have in one polity. I mean, what is Cyprus the closest example of that? We certainly, well, you could use Lebanon if you want a dysfunctional state. I don't see how you do that. It was Ben Franklin who said proximity breeds contempt and children. That's what he said. Contempt and children. The contempt part is definitely the case. I still believe, and I will believe to the end of my days, that the only solution is separation through negotiations and satisfying the territorial and religious interests of both sides. Otherwise, I don't see how you do this. I really don't.
Well, we have a couple more minutes left, and I can't let you go without asking you about Iran, because of the situation, the aftermath of the assassinating Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the Iranian scientist. Are we headed towards war? Is Biden going to be hamstrung by whatever action this administration may or may not take with the Iranians? And also on normalization, what is the future of normalizations under Biden?
I think Biden will have inherited the one aspect of the Trump administration's policy on the Arab-Israeli issue that needs to be tended to and kept moving in the right direction. The challenge for the Biden administration is to the degree to which they're prepared to link normalization to progress on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. You know, to a degree, the Israelis now have something to lose, and they need to be careful unless the Arab capacity to accept Israeli abuses of Palestinians is so unlimited that it doesn't really matter anymore, that you could see the Israelis being constrained a bit by the normalization process. If you added to that a certain amount of withholding on the part of Arab states that have yet to normalize with respect to the Palestinian issue, that's the challenge the Biden administration is going to face. And I think the Israelis will react very negatively to this linkage, you can imagine, because for Netanyahu, this is his dream. It's peace for peace. We don't give up anything. And we are now legitimized in the region. And the Netanyahu doctrine appears to be working. That's the extraordinary thing. It appears to be working. More countries recognize Israel in more parts of the world now than at any time since the state of Israel was created, despite the fact that the prime minister is not interested in any sort of deal with the Palestinians that comes close to meeting their needs. It's a fascinating observation, because the notion, the left in this country, in the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community, and the left in Israel, banked on Israel becoming a pariah nation as a consequence of their failure to resolve the Palestinian question. They're not becoming a pariah nation at all. They're becoming more accepted in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, among the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. It's a stunning development. And you have to ask yourself the question, why is it happening? I'm not entirely sure I could answer that question. As far as Iran is concerned, my view of this is very simple. There are no transformational deals between this Iranian regime and the United States. If we think we're going to get an agreement that deals with the nuclear issue, that restricts Iran's ballistic missile program, and that somehow caps Iran's behavior in the region, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, and Lebanon, that would mean Iran would be turned into a different country. That's not going to happen. So forget the transformational agreement. You're going to have to go back to something that looks like the JCPOA, a transactional deal. Now, that's going to be very hard, since Biden has intimated that he wants a longer and stronger JCPOA. Once the Iranians return to their commitments, he'll return to our commitments on sanctions, and then the two of them will sit down and negotiate this longer and stronger agreement. I can't see that happening. What worries me, frankly, Said, is not the nuclear issue. What worries me is the escalatory cycle that's been building and that could result in the wake of Fakhrizadeh's assassination in a response either in the next 50 days before the inauguration, or, and you've seen the reports that Iran is now basically saying, we're booting out the IAEA inspectors and we're ramping up our enrichment capacity if by February you don't remove sanctions. Now, whether that's a bluff, a test, a negotiating ploy, I don't know. But I worry about an Iranian-Israeli confrontation that gets out of hand. And the Lebanon piece of this is the way it really gets out of hand. Because Iran and Israel don't share contiguous borders. Israel does share a contiguous border and is within range now of many of Hezbollah's high trajectory weapons. That's what worries me.
Well, on that
Cheery
sobering
note.
yes, sobering note. Thank you very much,
You're
Aaron.
welcome.
It's
I
always
enjoyed it,
a
Saeed.
pleasure and an honor, and
Wonderful
I
talking.
look forward to more interviews like this in the future, whether for my newspaper or events like this. And I thank our audience. And I'm going to turn you back to
Yeah. Aaron, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here. So thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And we hope to have you back later.
Anytime.
Thank you. Have a
Anytime.
great day. Thank you so much.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.